The construction of the RMS Lusitania began as a question only wealth can ask. Not whether it can be built, whether it should be, whether the ocean has room for one more monument to speed, to empire, to the delusion that money can outrun consequence. This is the dark story of England's most expensive shipwreck. A luxury travel turned into a war zone. In the spring of 1904, a room full of men in London made a decision that would cost £2 million, 1,200 lives, and the credibility of an entire maritime doctrine. They did not know this yet. They saw only the threat. Germany was winning. Not with guns, with turbines, with steel, with vessels so fast, so grand, that British passengers were choosing Hamburg over Liverpool. The SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse had taken the blue riband. The Deutschland followed. Then came the Kronprinz Wilhelm. Each one faster, each one German. Each one proof that the Atlantic was no longer a British lake. Cunard Line, once the undisputed monarch of transatlantic luxury, was hemorrhaging prestige. Prestige in this world was currency. Lose it, and the titled family's book elsewhere. The bankers sail elsewhere. The diplomats, the industrialists, the silent wealth that never haggles over fare, they all vanish, and with them, the margins. So Cunard went to the government, not as beggars, as partners. They arrived with renderings, with specifications, with a proposal so audacious it required state backing to even begin. They would build not one, but 2 liners, sister ships. Vessels capable of 25 knots sustained, fast enough to reclaim the crossing record, large enough to redefine luxury at sea, expensive enough that no private company could shoulder the risk alone. The Admiralty listened. They had their own concerns. War was not a question of if, but when. And when it came, Britain would need fast ships. Ships that could carry troops, supplies, munitions. Ships that could outrun submarines. Ships designed as liners, but adaptable as auxiliary cruisers. The deal was struck in committee rooms, where decisions float on sentences carefully worded. Cunard would receive an annual subsidy of £75,000. In exchange, the Admiralty gained the right to requisition the vessels in wartime, to retrofit them, to arm them, to use them as the state saw fit. On paper, it was a bailout disguised as patriotism. In practice, it was a binding contract written in peacetime and enforceable in war. The ships would be designed with concealed gun mounts, with reinforced decks, with coal bunkers positioned to double as armor. Civilian vessels with military compromises baked into the blueprints before the first rivet was hammered. The first ship would be named Lusitania. The cost was projected at £1.5 million. Just the hull, just the engines. Before carpets, before crystal, before the hand-carved mahogany paneling and the Baroque smoking rooms and the a la carte restaurant modeled after the Ritz. Before any of the excess that would justify the ticket price. £1.5 million in 1904 was the price of a small war. It was the annual budget of a mid-sized city. It was more than Cunard had ever spent on a single asset. But the German liners were selling out. The crossing times were shrinking. The window to reclaim dominance was closing. So they committed. And once the steel was ordered, once the contracts were signed, once the shipyard at Clydebank began clearing space for a vessel longer than 3 football fields, there was no reversing course. The ship became inevitable. A momentum asset. Capital in motion, burning cash at every stage, unable to stop because stopping would mean admitting the entire venture was a mistake. The design was finalized in late 1904. She would be 787 feet long, 31,000 gross tons, 4 direct drive steam turbines, an experimental propulsion system, unproven at this scale, chosen because it promised speed, 25 knots. Fast enough to cross the Atlantic in under 5 days. Fast enough, the thinking went, to outrun any threat. But speed has a price, not just in pounds sterling, in physics, in compromises. To achieve 25 knots, Lusitania needed power. Power required coal. Coal required space. Space required length. Length required structural reinforcement. Reinforcement added weight. Weight demanded more power. The design became a feedback loop, each optimization creating a new constraint. The hull was divided into compartments by watertight bulkheads. This was standard practice. What was not standard was how those bulkheads were arranged. Lusitania had longitudinal coal bunkers running the length of the ship, positioned between the hull and the passenger spaces. In theory, they would absorb torpedo impacts. In theory, coal would cushion the blow, slowing water ingress, buying time for evacuation. In practice, coal bunkers are not armor. They are storage. And when breached, they flood. Fast. The design assumed a single impact, a single breach, a slow and manageable crisis. It did not account for secondary explosions. It did not account for the reality that coal dust, when ignited, becomes a bomb. But these were distant concerns in 1904. The ship was still lines on paper, still a vision, still a promise that British engineering could outbuild, outspend, and outlast any rival. Construction began in June 1905. The keel was laid with ceremony, champagne, speeches, photographs of men in top hats standing beside steel frames that would soon be hidden beneath decks and carpets and the machinery of luxury. The shipyard at Clydebank employed 3,000 men, riveters, welders, carpenters, electricians, painters, each one paid by the day, each one dependent on the ship's completion for continued work. The project became its own economy. Local suppliers provided rivets, cables, pipes, glass, wood. Subcontractors handled interiors. The turbine engines were manufactured separately, then transported by rail and barge to the yard. The logistics were staggering. Every delay rippled, every change order compounded, and change orders came constantly. Because luxury, once imagined, is never static. Cunard's executives visited the ship during construction and saw opportunities. The dining saloon could be larger. The first-class cabins could have private bathrooms. The grand staircase could be wider, grander, more photographable. Each enhancement made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a cascade. The original budget of £1.5 million was a fiction by 1906. The true cost was approaching £2 million, possibly more. Accounting became creative. Some expenses were capitalized, others amortized. Still others quietly absorbed into operational budgets or future projections. The ship was eating money faster than it could generate revenue, and it had not yet touched water. But stopping was unthinkable. The Germans were still winning. The British press was watching. The Admiralty had already paid the first subsidy installment. Cunard was committed. The ship was committed. The only direction was forward. Lusitania was launched in June 1906. 13 months of fitting out followed. Installing engines, running cables, plastering walls, laying floors, hanging chandeliers, upholstering chairs, stocking kitchens, training crew. Every detail calibrated to convey one message. This was not merely transportation. This was a floating expression of British supremacy. The first-class accommodations were modelled after the finest hotels in London and Paris. The dining saloon could seat 500. The smoking room featured Italian marble and leather chairs. The grand staircase was topped with a dome of leaded glass. There were libraries, writing rooms, veranda cafes, a gymnasium, even a nursery for wealthy children travelling with nannies. Second-class accommodations on Lusitania rivaled first class on older ships. Third class, intended for immigrants, was still better than most transatlantic steerage. The ship was designed to extract maximum revenue from every deck, every cabin, every fare tier. But luxury has metabolism. It consumes. Constantly. The ship required a permanent crew of over 800. Stokers to feed the boilers, engineers to monitor the turbines, stewards to serve meals, maids to clean cabins, cooks bakers, butchers, electricians, carpenters, musicians, each one on payroll, each one expecting wages, food, lodging, medical care. Even docked, the ship burned money. Maintenance, insurance, docking fees, security, depreciation. The vessel was a financial organism, breathing cash, exhaling obligation. And then there was coal. The ship's appetite was monstrous, 6,000 tons per crossing. At peacetime prices, coal was manageable. But prices fluctuated. Supply chains faltered. Labor strikes interrupted delivery. And every ton had to be loaded by hand, shoveled into bunkers, then shoveled again into furnaces by stokers working in 100-degree heat. The economics were simple and brutal. Lusitania had to sail full. Every crossing. First class, second class, third class. All cabins booked. Premium fares from elites. Volume fares from immigrants. Cargo revenue from mail contracts and freight. Only then did the numbers approach profitability. And even then, the ship depended on the Admiralty subsidy. £75,000 per year. Guaranteed. As long as the ship remained available for requisition. As long as Cunard honored the contract. As long as the vessel could be converted, on demand, into an instrument of war. Insurance was negotiated before the maiden voyage. The hull was valued at approximately £2 million. Lloyd's of London underwrote the primary policy, with syndicates sharing the risk. Coverage included collision, fire, grounding, and mechanical failure. Standard maritime perils. War risk was a separate conversation. In 1907, war seemed distant. Europe was tense but stable. Naval conflicts were regional, limited, manageable. War risk premiums were modest. Exclusions were vague. The policies assumed any conflict would be short, localized, and resolvable through diplomacy. Nobody was pricing in total war. Nobody was imagining submarines hunting passenger liners. Nobody was calculating the liability of selling tickets to civilians and then sailing them into a combat zone. The policies were signed, the premiums paid, the coverage locked in, and for 7 years, it was enough. Lusitania's maiden voyage was September 1907. She departed Liverpool with nearly 3,000 people aboard. Passengers, crew, journalists, investors, Cunard executives. The crossing took 5 days. She arrived in New York to fanfare. Crowds, photographs, headlines celebrating British engineering. The ship had reclaimed the record. The blue riband was British again. For a brief moment, the investment seemed justified. The ship was profitable in perception, prestigious in headlines, a triumph of capital and craft. But perception is not accounting. And the numbers, when examined closely, told a different story. Lusitania was popular, celebrated, fully booked on her best crossings, but the operating margins were thin, fuel costs were high, crew payroll was relentless, maintenance was constant, depreciation was inevitable, and the subsidy, that £75,000 per year, was not profit. It was a tether, a binding obligation that would activate the moment war arrived. The ship sailed for 7 years. Liverpool to New York. New York to Liverpool. 101 Atlantic crossings. Carrying industrialists and immigrants, honeymooners and spies, families and fortune seekers. The vessel became routine, reliable, expected. And in that routine, the vulnerabilities were forgotten. The dual-use design, the coal bunker compromises, the war risk clauses buried in the insurance policies, the fact that the ship, for all its grandeur, was built to a military specification disguised as a civilian dream. In August 1914, the world ignited. The war everyone assumed would be short and limited became total. Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare around the British Isles. Any vessel, civilian or military, carrying supplies to Britain was now a target. The Admiralty examined Lusitania for conversion to an armed merchant cruiser. They found her unsuitable. Too large? Too fast? Too expensive to operate? Too visible? The coal consumption made her impractical for military patrols. The passenger accommodations were useless for troop transport. She was a luxury liner designed with a wartime clause no one actually wanted to enforce. So the ship continued sailing as a civilian vessel, carrying passengers, carrying mail, and quietly carrying cargo that blurred the line between commerce and contraband, ammunition, fuses, shell casings. Not enough to make her a military target by law, enough to make her a target by logic. The insurance policies shifted. Low war risk coverage tightened. Premiums spiked. Exclusions were rewritten. Lloyd's syndicates began calculating the probability of loss. Some withdrew entirely. Others capped their exposure. The ship was still insured, technically. But the coverage was no longer comprehensive. The replacement value was no longer guaranteed. Cunard kept selling tickets, and people kept buying them. Because Lusitania was fast. Because she was British. Because she has sailed 202 crossings without incident. Because the alternative was waiting months for slower, less prestigious vessels. Because denial, in wartime, feels safer than caution. On May 1st, 1915, Lusitania departed New York for Liverpool. Nearly 2,000 people aboard. Passengers who had read the warnings published in newspapers by the German embassy. Warnings that were dismissed, ignored, rationalized away. The ship carried 173 tons of cargo. Munitions listed vaguely on manifests. Legal under neutral shipping rules, but enough to justify German attention. Enough to shift the calculus from passenger liner to legitimate target in the minds of submarine commanders scanning the Irish coast. For 6 days, the ship sailed east, through calm seas, through fog, through waters patrolled by German U-boats. The Royal Navy offered no escort. The Admiralty sent warnings, but no protection. The captain received instructions to zigzag, to increase speed, to avoid headlands. He followed some, ignored others. Because fuel was expensive. Because zigzagging was tedious. Because nothing had happened yet, and routine feels safer than vigilance. On May 7th, the ship was 13 miles off the southern coast of Ireland, slowing as she approached Liverpool, visible, predictable, unescorted. A torpedo was fired. One torpedo. It struck the starboard side, just forward of the bridge. The impact breached the hull. Water flooded into the compartments. The ship listed immediately. And then came the second explosion. Not from another torpedo. From within. A massive detonation that shattered the forward structure, sent debris skyward, and doomed any hope of controlled flooding. The coal dust, the munitions, the volatile cargo, something ignited. The ship's own design, its own compromises, turned the initial breach into a catastrophic failure. Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. 1,198 people died. Passengers drowned, crew drowned, lifeboats capsized. Bodies floated in the cold Atlantic for days. The ship, the 2 million pound monument to speed and prestige, was gone. Resting on the seabed, 12 miles offshore, in 300 feet of water. Unsalvageable, unreachable, a total loss. And the question that had been deferred for 11 years, the question that capital always delays but never escapes, finally demanded an answer. Who pays? The ship, in her glory years, sold a fiction so seductive that even accountants believed it. Speed as salvation. Luxury as immunity. The idea that a vessel moving fast enough, decorated lavishly enough, insured expensively enough, could generate wealth simply by existing. That the mathematics would somehow resolve themselves if only the bookings remained strong and the headlines stayed positive. For 7 years, Lusitania was profitable in the only currency that mattered to her owners: attention. She was photographed, written about, booked solid by families who wanted to say they had crossed on her. The ship became a brand, a status marker, An experience wealthy travelers pursued not for the destination, but for the 5 days of floating through an empire's self-image. The first-class fare from Liverpool to New York was £32 10 shillings in 1908, roughly £4,000 in modern terms. For that price, you received a private cabin with mahogany paneling, access to the Grand Saloon, where orchestras played during dinner, the smoking room with its Italian marble fireplace and leather armchairs arranged in conversational clusters, the veranda cafe where you could take tea while watching the Atlantic scroll past at 25 knots. Second class was £12. Third class was £6. The ship was designed to stratify wealth vertically. First class occupied the upper decks, where the ride was smoothest and the portholes largest. Second class filled the middle. Third class immigrant families and laborers were berthed deep in the hull, closer to the engine noise, farther from the lifeboats, paying just enough to justify the crossing. Cunard's revenue model depended on volume at the bottom and margin at the top. A full third class manifest covered operational costs. Second class provided cushion. First class generated profit. The ship needed all 3 tiers booked to approach solvency. And in the early years, she achieved it. The maiden voyage carried 2,001 people. Subsequent crossings ranged from 1,500 to 2,300, depending on season and competition. Summer was peak. Winter was lean. But the ship sailed regardless. Because stopping meant losing the mail contracts, losing the subsidy, losing the schedule slot in New York Harbor, losing momentum. And momentum, for a ship like Lusitania, was everything. She was not a vessel you could idle, not a ship you could lay up during off-seasons. The operating costs ran continuously. Crew wages, docking fees, maintenance, depreciation, insurance premiums. Every day the ship existed, she consumed capital, whether she moved or not. Coal was the largest variable cost. 6,000 tons per crossing, burned in 48 hours of continuous steaming. Loaded in Liverpool by hand. Shoveled into bunkers by dock workers paid by the ton. Then shoveled again, during the crossing, by stokers working 4-hour shifts in furnace rooms where the temperature reached 120 degrees. The stokers were invisible to first-class passengers. They worked below decks, feeding coal into the boilers that generated steam, that drove the turbines that turned the propellers that moved the ship at 25 knots. Each man shoveled roughly 1 ton of coal per shift. 12 men per boiler room. 4 boiler rooms. Continuous operation. The human cost of speed, hidden in the bilge, paid at subsistence wages. Coal prices fluctuated. In 1908, Welsh anthracite cost approximately 12 shillings per ton. By 1912, it had risen to 15 shillings. By 1914, 18 shillings. A single Atlantic crossing consumed 6,000 tons, which at 1914 prices meant £5,400 in fuel alone. Before crew wages, before food, before docking fees, before anything else. And fuel efficiency was non-linear. Lusitania's turbines were optimized for 25 knots. Running slower saved coal, but not proportionally. Dropping to 22 knots reduced consumption by only 15%, while adding nearly a day to the crossing. Passengers paid for speed. Speed required fuel. The ship was trapped in her own design logic. Maintenance was constant and expensive. Seawater corrodes. Salt air oxidizes. Engines wear. Hulls accumulate marine growth. Every 6 months, the ship required dry docking, scraping the hull, repainting, inspecting the propellers, overhauling the turbines. Each dry docking took 2 weeks and cost thousands of pounds. The interiors required perpetual upkeep. Carpets absorbed salt and mildew. Wooden paneling warped from humidity. Upholstery faded under electric lighting. Brass fittings tarnished. The ship was a floating 5-star hotel, operating in the worst possible environment for luxury materials. Every surface was fighting entropy. Cunard employed a rotating maintenance crew, carpenters, painters, electricians, plumbers. They worked during crossings, repairing damage, replacing fixtures, touching up cosmetic details. Passengers rarely saw them, but their wages, their tools, their materials, all of it flowed into the ship's operating budget, a hidden metabolism that never rested. The crew payroll was equally relentless. 850 people employed per crossing, divided into departments, each with its own hierarchy, its own union, its own pay scale. The deck department, officers, quartermasters, lookouts, able seamen, responsible for navigation, safety, cargo handling. The senior officers earned 50 to 80 pounds per month. The able seamen earned 5. The engine department, engineers, firemen, stokers, greasers, responsible for propulsion, electrical systems, boilers. The chief engineer earned 70 pounds per month. The stokers earned 6. The steward department, waiters, cooks, bakers, cabin stewards, maids, bartenders, musicians, responsible for passenger comfort, paid partly in wages, partly in tips. The tips were supposed to supplement the wages, but in practice, they determined whether stewards could afford to keep working. All told, Cunard's crew payroll for a single crossing was approximately £3,000. 10 crossings per year meant £30,000 annually just in wages. Add food, lodging, medical care, uniform costs, and the number climbed past 40,000. And the crew only got paid when the ship sailed. Layovers were unpaid. Sick leave was unpaid. If a crossing was cancelled, the crew went home without wages. They were contract laborers, not salaried employees. The ship consumed them the same way it consumed coal. Burned them during operation. Discarded them during downtime. Insurance premiums crept upward every year. Not dramatically, just steadily. A few percentage points annually. Enough to erode margins without triggering alarm. In 1907, Lloyd's syndicates charged 2% of hull value annually for comprehensive maritime coverage. That was £40,000 per year for Lusitania. By 1910, it was 2.5%. By 1913, 3%. The increase was justified by actuarial data. More ships, more crossings, more variables, higher payouts on other vessels. The risk was spreading, and premiums adjusted accordingly. War risk coverage was separate. In peacetime, it was almost negligible. A fraction of a percent. A formality. The policies covered acts of war, piracy, naval engagement, government seizure. But these seemed remote, theoretical. The premiums reflected that assessment. Lusitania's war risk coverage in 1910 cost approximately £2,000 annually. Cheap insurance for an unlikely event. But geopolitical tension was rising. The Balkans were unstable. Naval arms races were accelerating. Germany was expanding its submarine fleet. Britain was expanding its dreadnought program. Insurance underwriters watched these developments and recalculated. War risk premiums doubled by 1912. Doubled again by 1914. And the coverage itself began to narrow. Exclusions appeared. Fine print expanded. The policies still existed, but their scope was shrinking. Cunard's executives reviewed the numbers quarterly. They saw revenue holding steady. They saw expenses creeping upward. They saw margins thinning, but they also saw something more valuable than profit: prestige. Lusitania was a flagship, a statement, an asset whose value extended beyond accounting. The ship attracted investors, reassured shareholders, convinced the Admiralty that Cunard remained Britain's premier maritime company. She was a halo asset. Her existence justified subsidies, secured mail contracts, anchored the entire fleet's reputation. Losing money on Lusitania was acceptable as long as the company profited elsewhere. And for years, the company did profit. Lusitania had a sister ship, Mauretania, equally fast, equally luxurious. Together, they dominated the transatlantic route. They alternated schedules, competed for records, kept the blue riband British. The two ships formed a duopoly, forcing competitors to either match their speed or accept second-tier status. But duopolies are fragile. They depend on both assets remaining operational. If one fails, the other cannot carry the load alone. The mathematics of fleet management require redundancy. Backup vessels. Slower ships to absorb overflow. Lusitania and Mauretania were paired thoroughbreds. Magnificent but brittle. One injury, one dry docking, one delay, and the entire schedule collapsed. Cunard operated other ships, older and slower, to fill the gaps. The Carpathia, the Caronia, the Carmonia. These vessels were profitable in their own right. Less glamorous, but more reliable. They did not burn 6,000 tons of coal per crossing. They did not require 800 crew members. They did not generate headlines, but they generated cash flow. Steady, predictable, boring cash flow. Lusitania, by contrast, generated headlines and consumed cash. The ship was profitable in narrative, not in ledgers. Her crossings were celebrated. Her passenger lists were published. Her speed records were front-page news. But the actual financial returns, when measured against the capital investment, the operating costs, the subsidies required to keep her afloat, those returns were questionable. No one asked the question publicly. Cunard's annual reports listed Lusitania as a flagship asset, valued at £2 million. The depreciation was amortized over 20 years. The assumption was that the ship would sail for 2 decades, earn back her cost, and retire gracefully. That was the model. That was the plan. But ships do not retire gracefully. They age, they wear, they become obsolete. By 1914, Lusitania was 7 years old, still fast, still beautiful, but newer ships were being designed. Faster turbines, better compartment layouts. Lessons learned from her construction applied to the next generation. The window of technological superiority was closing. And then there was the elephant buried in every insurance policy, every subsidy contract, every board meeting where Lusitania's future was discussed. The war clause. The Admiralty subsidy was not charity. It was a contract. £75,000 per year in exchange for availability. The ship could be requisitioned at any time, for any duration, for any purpose the Admiralty deemed necessary. Cunard would be compensated for lost commercial revenue, but the calculation of that compensation was left vague. Determined later. Negotiated in crisis. When war began in August 1914, the Admiralty examined Lusitania for conversion. They sent inspectors to Liverpool. They reviewed her specifications. They calculated her fuel consumption, her crew requirements, her suitability for various military roles. Troop transport. Too luxurious, too slow to load, too expensive to operate. Armed merchant cruiser. Too large, too visible, too fuel-hungry for patrols. Hospital ship, possible, but her speed was wasted in that role. Munitions transport, viable, but risky given her profile and her civilian registry. The Admiralty concluded she was more useful as a passenger liner. She could maintain the transatlantic connection, carry mail, transport civilians, and quietly supplement her cargo holds with war materials. Shells, fuses, rifle cartridges. Nothing that violated neutrality laws. Nothing that technically made her a military target, but enough to blur the lines, enough to make submarines take notice. So Lusitania continued sailing, with passengers, with cargo, with a crew that knew the risks but had no better options. Employment in wartime was scarce. Stokers and stewards could not afford to refuse work. They signed on, crossing after crossing, because staying home meant starvation. The passengers, meanwhile, believed in the ship's invincibility. Speed was armor. Britishness was protection. The ship had crossed the Atlantic 200 times without incident. Surely that record meant something. Surely Cunard would not sell tickets if the danger were real. But the insurance companies knew differently. War risk premiums spiked the moment hostilities began. Coverage limits were slashed. Exclusions multiplied. By early 1915, Lloyd's syndicates were charging 8% of hull value for war risk coverage. That was £160,000 annually. An impossible figure. Cunard negotiated. They secured partial coverage, enough to satisfy regulators, not enough to cover a total loss. The ship sailed anyway, because stopping meant forfeiting the subsidy, breaking the mail contracts, conceding the route to neutral vessels, admitting defeat, and so the fiction persisted. Lusitania was profitable. Lusitania was safe. Lusitania was a triumph of British engineering and luxury. The headline said so. The passenger manifests confirmed it. The quarterly reports listed her as a performing asset. But beneath the surface, the numbers told a different story. A ship consuming more than she earned. A vessel dependent on subsidies that could evaporate with a policy change. An asset insured for less than her replacement value, sailing into waters where submarines hunted with impunity. The final crossing, the one that departed New York on May 1st, 1915, carried 1,959 people. First-class cabins were only half full. Second class was better. Third class was packed with immigrants and families eager to return to Britain despite the danger. The cargo holds carried 173 tons of munitions. Legal, documented, profitable. The tickets generated approximately £30,000 in revenue. The cargo added another 5,000. Coal cost 5,000. Crew wages 3,000. Insurance, docking, maintenance, amortization, another several thousand. On paper, the crossing was marginally profitable. Barely. If nothing went wrong. Something went wrong. The torpedo struck at 2:10 in the afternoon. The secondary explosion followed seconds later. The ship listed 15 degrees within minutes. Lifeboats jammed. Davits failed. Passengers panicked. The crew, trained in peacetime drills, found their procedures useless when the deck was tilted and the ship was sinking faster than physics should allow. 18 minutes. That was how long Lusitania took to sink. 18 minutes from impact to disappearance. Not enough time to launch half the lifeboats. Not enough time for nearby ships to respond. Not enough time for the passengers in third class, deep in the hull, to even reach the deck. The ship went down bow first, stern rising, propellers spinning uselessly in the air before the entire structure slid beneath the surface. 1,198 people died. Passengers, crew, children. The bodies floated for days, some washing ashore in Ireland, others lost to the Atlantic. And the £2 million asset, the ship that was supposed to sail for 20 years, the vessel that was insured and subsidized and celebrated, vanished. Completely, irrevocably, gone. The financial reckoning began before the survivors reached shore. War does not rewrite contracts gradually. It detonates them. On August 4th, 1914, the moment Britain declared war on Germany, every insurance policy, every subsidy agreement, every commercial assumption governing Lusitania's operation became subject to reinterpretation. Clauses that had seemed hypothetical for 7 years suddenly activated. Language buried in fine print became binding. And the question of who bore risk, Cunard, the insurers, the government, or the passengers, shifted from abstract legal theory to immediate financial exposure. The war risk clauses were explicit. Coverage applied only to perils of the sea in peacetime. Acts of war, torpedo, mine, naval engagement, government seizure, fell under separate policies with separate premiums and separate exclusions. When hostilities began, the peacetime policies narrowed. Some syndicates withdrew entirely. Others capped their exposure at fractions of the ship's replacement value. Still others inserted clauses requiring the vessel to avoid designated war zones, to sail only under Admiralty guidance, to implement specific safety protocols. Cunard's insurance broker scrambled to maintain coverage. Lloyd's of London remained the primary underwriter, but the syndicate structure meant dozens of individual insurers shared the risk. Each one reassessed their position in August 1914. Some renewed at higher premiums, others declined. The final coverage, cobbled together across multiple policies, insured Lusitania for approximately £1 million in the event of war-related loss, half her replacement value. Enough to satisfy regulatory requirements, not enough to rebuild. The Admiralty subsidy continued, £75,000 annually. But the terms shifted subtly. The ship was now considered a government asset, available for requisition, but not yet requisitioned. She remained under commercial operation, but with military priorities. The Admiralty could direct her movements, dictate her cargo, impose speed and routing restrictions. Cunard retained operational control, but not strategic autonomy. The ship existed in a legal gray zone: civilian registry, military obligations, commercial passengers, wartime risks. And the passengers kept buying tickets. This remains one of the most perplexing elements of the story. Not that Cunard continued selling passage. That makes financial sense. But that passengers continued purchasing it, even as the risks became undeniable. Even as German embassy warnings appeared in New York newspapers alongside Cunard's advertisements. Even as other ships were torpedoed, mined, or captured in the waters around Britain. Part of it was denial. The belief that international law prohibited attacking passenger liners. That civilian vessels were protected by centuries of maritime convention. That Germany, despite its threats, would not actually sink a ship full of Americans and neutrals. Part of it was confidence in British naval superiority. The Royal Navy was the largest in the world. Surely they would protect transatlantic shipping. Surely they would escort valuable vessels through dangerous waters. Surely Lusitania, as a flagship, would receive special protection. Part of it was economics. Other ships were slower, less comfortable, or booked months in advance. Lusitania offered confirmed passage on a fixed schedule. For businessmen, for families with urgent travel, for immigrants trying to reach home, the alternatives were unacceptable. Risk was weighed against inconvenience. Inconvenience felt more immediate. And part of it was the ship herself. 7 years of successful crossings. 200 voyages without incident. The vessel had earned a reputation for reliability that transcended rational risk assessment. She felt safe. She looked safe. Her size, her speed, her British registry, all of it projected invulnerability. But invulnerability is not an asset class. It does not appear on balance sheets. It does not protect against torpedoes. The liability calculations were equally muddled. Cunard's ticket contracts included standard limitation clauses. In the event of death, the company's liability was capped at statutory limits, approximately £100 per passenger under British law. This was common practice, designed to prevent catastrophic lawsuits from bankrupting shipping companies after accidents. But those limits were written for peacetime accidents, collisions, groundings, mechanical failures, acts of God, and navigational errors. They were not written for wartime losses, for government-subsidized vessels carrying military cargo into active combat zones while selling tickets to civilians. The legal ambiguity was staggering. If the ship were sunk, who bore responsibility? Cunard, for operating in dangerous waters. The Admiralty, for failing to provide escort. The government, for subsidizing a vessel designed for military conversion. Germany, for attacking a civilian ship. Or the passengers themselves, for accepting known risks. No one wanted to answer that question, so no one asked it. Cunard's legal department drafted memos that were never circulated. The Admiralty issued guidelines that were never enforced. Lloyd's underwriters priced risk into premiums, but declined to comment publicly. And passengers signed ticket contracts without reading the limitation clauses printed in 6-point type on the back. The ship's final voyage was booked under these conditions. Tickets sold. Cargo loaded. Crew hired. All of it proceeding as though the vessel was still operating in peacetime, as though the Atlantic was still a commercial waterway rather than a hunting ground. The passenger manifest included families, children, infants, 129 Americans, whose deaths would create diplomatic consequences. wealthy travelers who assumed their status afforded protection, and third-class immigrants who had saved for years to afford passage, who had no choice but to trust that Cunard would not sell them tickets to their own deaths. The cargo manifest was more carefully managed. 173 tons of munitions, listed vaguely, categorized as small arms ammunition, fuses, and empty shell casings. All of it legal under American neutrality laws, none of it technically enough to reclassify the ship as a military target under international law, but all of it enough to give Germany justification, if justification were needed. Cunard knew what was being loaded. The manifests were signed by company officials. But the decision to carry war materials was not Cunard's alone. The Admiralty encouraged it. The British government needed the supplies. American manufacturers needed the revenue. And Lusitania had cargo space that would otherwise go empty. Economically, it made sense. Strategically, it made sense. Legally, it existed in the same gray zone as everything else about the ship's wartime operation. The warnings came from multiple directions. The German embassy placed advertisements in New York newspapers on May 1st, the day Lusitania was scheduled to depart. The text was unambiguous. Vessels flying the British flag were liable to destruction in the waters around Britain. Travelers sailing in the war zone did so at their own risk. Cunard dismissed the warnings as propaganda, designed to frighten passengers, to disrupt commerce, to undermine British morale. The company issued reassurances. The ship was fast. The route was patrolled. The Royal Navy was vigilant. Nothing would happen. The Admiralty sent coded messages to the ship during the crossing. Warnings about submarine activity off the Irish coast. Instructions to zigzag. Instructions to maintain maximum speed. Instructions to avoid headlands where U-boats lurked. The messages were received. Some were followed. Others were ignored or interpreted loosely. Because fuel was expensive. Because zigzagging was tedious. Because the captain had crossed these waters 200 times and nothing had ever happened. Captain William Turner was a competent, experienced officer. Not brilliant, but reliable. He had commanded Lusitania for 2 years. He knew her capabilities, her quirks, her limitations. He understood the risks, but he also understood that his orders were contradictory. Maintain speed, but conserve fuel. Zigzag, but stay on schedule. Avoid headlands, but reach Liverpool on time. Every instruction contained trade-offs. Every decision involved guessing which risk was more urgent. On the morning of May 7th, the ship was off the southern coast of Ireland. The crossing had been smooth. The weather was clear. Visibility was excellent. Turner had received Admiralty warnings about submarine activity in the area. He had slowed the ship to 15 knots to time his arrival at Liverpool for the morning tide. He was not zigzagging. Fuel conservation and scheduling concerns overrode evasive maneuvers. At 2:10 in the afternoon, a lookout spotted a torpedo wake, approximately 700 yards away, heading directly for the starboard side. There was no time to turn, no time to accelerate, no time to do anything except brace. The torpedo struck just aft of the bridge, below the waterline. The impact breached the hull. Water flooded into the compartments. And then came the second explosion. This is where the official narrative fractures, where myth and mechanism collide, where questions outnumber answers and certainty dissolves into speculation. The second explosion was massive, far larger than the torpedo itself could produce. It shattered the forward superstructure, sent debris skyward, created a mushroom cloud of coal dust and steam visible for miles. The explosion accelerated the sinking, dooming any chance of controlled flooding or orderly evacuation. What caused it? The official German explanation: munitions. The British carried contraband. The ship was a legitimate target. The secondary explosion proved she was carrying explosives beyond what the manifest listed. Therefore, her sinking was justified. The official British explanation, Coal dust. The torpedo ruptured coal bunkers. Pulverized coal ignited in the presence of oxygen and flame. A known hazard. Tragic but accidental. Nothing to do with munitions. Alternative theories emerged immediately and have persisted for over a century. Some claim the ship was carrying high explosives, undeclared, hidden in cargo manifests. Others suggested the Admiralty deliberately withheld escort to allow the sinking, to draw America into the war. Still others proposed mechanical failure, a boiler explosion coinciding with the torpedo impact. The evidence is contradictory and incomplete. The cargo manifests listed munitions, but specified types and quantities that should not have produced an explosion of that magnitude. Survivors reported a second impact, but disagreed on its location and intensity. The wreck, examined multiple times over the decades, shows damage consistent with both internal explosion and torpedo strike, but the exact sequence remains unclear. What is clear is the outcome. The ship listed 15 degrees to starboard immediately. The bow began settling, the stern rose, and the time available for evacuation collapsed from hours to minutes. Lusitania's lifeboats were rated for calm seas and controlled lowering. They were not designed for a ship listing heavily and sinking rapidly. The davits jammed. The boats, when launched, swung inward and smashed against the hull. Some capsized immediately upon hitting the water. Others were swamped by passengers jumping from the deck. A few launched successfully, but were caught in the suction as the ship went down. The crew performed as well as training allowed, but training had been conducted in peacetime conditions. Drills assumed a stable deck, cooperative passengers, and time to organize. None of those assumptions held. The crew improvised. They cut ropes. They threw deck chairs and debris overboard as flotation. They directed passengers toward high ground as the bow sank lower. They stayed at their posts even as the deck tilted past the angle where standing was possible. The passengers faced a calculus no one should face. Stay with the ship and risk being pulled under when she sank. Jump into the Atlantic and risk hypothermia in 50-degree water. Fight for a place in a lifeboat that might capsize. Or trust that rescue would arrive in time. Many chose to stay inside. First-class passengers in their cabins, believing the ship could not actually sink. Third-class families trapped below decks, unable to navigate the tilting corridors and locked gates that separated them from the boat deck. Children in the nursery, watched over by nannies who did not abandon them even as the water rose. 18 minutes. From torpedo strike to final plunge. The bow went under first, pulling the rest of the structure downward. The stern rose vertically, propellers spinning in the air, before sliding beneath the surface. The suction was enormous. Debris, bodies, lifeboats, all of it dragged downward in the vortex. 1,198 people died, drowned in the initial sinking, succumbed to hypothermia in the water, crushed by debris, lost to the Atlantic. 761 survived, rescued by fishing boats, patrol vessels, and ships diverted to the scene, pulled from the water, wrapped in blankets, treated for shock and exposure, brought ashore in Ireland to face the reality that the unsinkable ship had sunk, that the safe passage had ended in catastrophe, that the ticket they purchased included a cost no one had disclosed. And in London, in the offices of Cunard and Lloyd's and the Admiralty, accountants began tallying the loss, not just in lives, in pounds sterling, in insurance claims, in liability exposure, in the cascading financial consequences of a £2 million asset that no longer existed. The ship was gone. The revenue stopped. The subsidy became irrelevant. And the question that had been deferred, ignored, rationalized away for 11 years, finally demanded an answer. Who pays for a ship that should never have been built? For passengers who should never have been sold tickets? For a disaster that was simultaneously accidental and inevitable? The ledger snapped shut. But the reckoning had only just begun. The torpedo did not destroy £2 million. It relocated it. Capital does not vanish. It transforms. It migrates from one ledger to another, from one party's asset column to another's liability. The question after Lusitania sank was not whether the loss would be absorbed, but by whom, and over what timeline, and at what cost to reputation, to solvency, to the fiction that luxury assets are somehow exempt from the arithmetic of catastrophe. The insurance claims were filed within days. Cunard submitted documentation to Lloyd's of London. Hull loss, total constructive loss. The vessel was resting in 300 feet of water off the Irish coast. Unsalvageable. Irretrievable. The hull value was listed at £2 million. The claim requested $1 million. The maximum coverage assembled across multiple war risk policies. Lloyd's response was immediate and predictable. Denial pending investigation. The syndicates questioned everything. Was the vessel operating within the terms of coverage? Had the captain followed Admiralty instructions? Had Cunard disclosed the full cargo manifest? Was the ship carrying contraband beyond the listed munitions? Did the presence of war materials void the civilian vessel designation? And most critically, was the sinking an act of war or an act of negligence? The distinction mattered. If the sinking were classified as an act of war, a torpedo strike by a hostile submarine, then war risk policies applied, and Lloyd's owed the claim. If the sinking were attributed to negligence, improper cargo handling, failure to follow evasive protocols, inadequate safety measures, then the policies could be contested, the payout reduced, or the claim denied entirely. The investigation dragged through summer 1915. Lloyd's hired maritime surveyors. They interviewed survivors. They examined what cargo manifests existed. They reviewed Admiralty communications. They reconstructed the ship's final hours, looking for any detail that might limit liability. Cunard, meanwhile, faced pressure from multiple directions. Shareholders demanded answers. The Admiralty wanted clarity on subsidy obligations. The press wanted accountability. And families of the dead wanted compensation. The British government convened the Mersey Inquiry in June 1915. Lord Mersey, a respected jurist with maritime expertise, was tasked with determining culpability. The inquiry was public. Testimony was recorded. Survivors testified. Officers testified. Admiralty officials testified. The proceedings were covered extensively in newspapers, dissected in editorials, analyzed by legal scholars. But the inquiry was also constrained. Wartime secrecy limited what could be discussed publicly. Admiralty communications were classified. Cargo details were redacted. Strategic considerations overrode transparency. The inquiry became a performance, visible accountability without actual revelation. The findings, released in July, were carefully calibrated. The sinking was attributed to a German torpedo. The secondary explosion was caused by coal dust or possibly boiler failure. Captain Turner was criticized for not zigzagging and for approaching the coast too closely, but not held criminally negligent. Cunard was found to have operated within peacetime commercial standards. The Admiralty was absolved of responsibility for failing to provide escort. No one was held accountable. The disaster was framed as a tragedy of war, not a failure of judgment, or design, or regulatory oversight. This conclusion suited everyone involved. Germany could be blamed. Cunard could claim victim status. The Admiralty avoided scrutiny. And Lloyd's gained justification to classify the loss as an act of war, making the claim payable under war risk policies. But payable did not mean paid in full. Lloyd's syndicates negotiated. They acknowledged the claim. They accepted the vessel was a total loss. But they contested the valuation. £2 million was the construction cost in 1907. By 1915, the ship was 8 years old. Depreciation applied. Market value had declined. Replacement cost was speculative, given wartime conditions. Alternative vessels could be purchased for less. The final settlement, reached in late 1915, paid Cunard approximately £600,000. Less than one-third of the claimed value. Less than one-third of the original construction cost. The insurers absorbed the rest as a loss, distributed across syndicates, managed through reserves and reinsurance arrangements. £600,000. Enough to prevent Cunard's immediate bankruptcy. Not enough to replace the ship. Not nearly enough to restore the prestige or the competitive position or the transatlantic dominance the vessel had represented. Cunard's balance sheet took the hit immediately. Lusitania was written off as a total loss. The remaining asset value, over £1 million after depreciation, evaporated. The annual revenue from the ship, approximately £300,000 per year, disappeared. The mail contracts shifted to other vessels. The first-class passengers booked on competitors. But the financial damage extended beyond the hull. Lusitania had been the flagship, the brand, the marketing anchor for the entire fleet. Her loss signaled vulnerability. It suggested that speed was not armor, that British registry was not protection, that prestige could not prevent disaster. Bookings declined across Cunard's fleet in the months following the sinking. Not catastrophically, but measurably. Passengers shifted to neutral vessels, American ships, Norwegian ships, anything not flying a British flag. The revenue erosion was gradual but persistent, a slow bleed that compounded quarterly. The Admiralty subsidy continued, technically, but the terms renegotiated. The ship was gone. The obligation to provide requisitionable tonnage remained. Cunard still operated Mauritania, Lusitania's sister ship, but one ship could not fulfill a two-ship commitment. The subsidy was reduced to reflect the diminished capacity, from £75,000 annually to approximately £50,000. Another revenue loss, another margin compression. The government, despite the Mersey inquiry's findings, distanced itself from liability. The subsidy was a commercial contract, not a guarantee. The Admiralty had provided warnings. The ship had sailed under Cunard's operational control. The decision to carry passengers through a war zone was Cunard's. The government would not compensate for that choice. This position was legally defensible, but morally ambiguous. The ship had been designed to Admiralty specifications. The cargo had been encouraged by government officials. The route had been approved by military authorities. The distinction between state involvement and state liability was clear in contract law, less clear in public perception. Cunard did not challenge the government's position. Doing so would jeopardize future subsidies, future mail contracts, future cooperation. The company absorbed the loss quietly, adjusted its fleet strategy, and continued operating. But the most bitter reckoning was reserved for the families. 1,198 people died. Each death generated potential liability, wrongful death claims, survivor compensation, loss of income, emotional damages, medical expenses for survivors, funeral costs. The legal exposure was staggering. Cunard invoked the limitation clauses embedded in every ticket contract. Under British law, the company's liability for passenger deaths was capped at £100 per person. Total maximum exposure, approximately £120,000. The families were outraged. £100 for a life. For a child? For a breadwinner whose income had supported an entire household. The amount was insulting. Insufficient. A legal technicality weaponized against grief. But the law was clear. The limitation clauses were standard across the maritime industry. They had been upheld in previous cases. They existed precisely to prevent catastrophic liability from bankrupting shipping companies after disasters. Without such limits, a single sinking could destroy an entire fleet's financial viability. The American families had options. They could sue in American courts, where liability limits were less restrictive and juries more sympathetic. Many did. The lawsuits were consolidated into a single proceeding, heard in New York. The plaintiffs argued that Cunard had been negligent, that the company had sailed a vessel into a known war zone, that passengers had been misled about the risks, that the ticket price implied a duty of care that had been violated. Cunard's defense was procedural. The ticket contracts specified British jurisdiction. The limitation clauses were binding. The company had operated within legal and regulatory standards. The sinking was an act of war, not negligence. Germany was responsible, not Cunard. The case dragged through years of depositions, motions, appeals. The final settlement, reached in 1918, awarded American families an average of approximately $1,000 per death, roughly £200, twice the British statutory limit. Still, a fraction of what most families had sought. The British families received less, £100 per passenger, paid in installments over several years, no additional compensation for children, no adjustment for inflation or lost income. The amounts were processed through courts and insurance claims adjusters, each transaction grinding grief into paperwork. Some families rejected the payments, refused to sign releases. They kept the claims alive, hoping for future reconsideration or additional funds. But Cunard never increased the offers. The company had paid what the law required. Further compensation would set precedent, expose the company to future claims, undermine the limitation framework that protected the entire industry. The wreck itself became a secondary liability. Resting in 300 feet of water, 12 miles off the coast of Ireland, the hulk was technically Cunard's property. Salvage rights belonged to the company, but salvage was impractical. The depth was too great for early 20th century diving technology. The structure was collapsing. The cargo holds were flooded. The interior was disintegrating, and the wreck contained bodies. Passengers and crew trapped inside when the ship sank. Cunard faced pressure to attempt recovery, to provide closure for families. But the cost was prohibitive. The technology insufficient. The company declined. The bodies remained. Over decades, the wreck became a gravesite, a memorial, and perversely, a tourist attraction. Divers explored the site illegally. Artifacts were recovered and sold. The ship, even in death, was monetized. Salvaged portholes, deck plates, fixtures stolen and auctioned. Cunard held nominal ownership but lacked resources to protect the site. The company eventually relinquished claims, allowing the wreck to pass into legal ambiguity. By 1920, Lusitania had exited Cunard's ledger entirely. The insurance settlement was recorded. The liability claims were processed. The asset was written off. The revenue was gone. The ship existed only as historical footnote and accounting lesson. The financial autopsy revealed truths that prestige had obscured. Lusitania had never been profitable in the traditional sense. Her lifetime net earnings, after subtracting operating costs, maintenance, insurance, and debt service, were negative. The ship had consumed more capital than she generated. The subsidies had masked this. The brand value had justified it. But the arithmetic was unambiguous. The vessel had been a vehicle for ambition, not profit. A statement asset. A trophy. Built to project dominance, to reclaim prestige, to demonstrate that British engineering could outbuild any rival. And for 7 years, she succeeded in that mission. But success in symbolism does not translate to success in accounting. The loss rippled through British maritime strategy. The Admiralty reconsidered dual-use designs. Future liners would not be built with wartime conversion in mind. The compromises, reduced compartments, coal bunker armor, gun mounts, had made the ship vulnerable without making her militarily useful. The doctrine was quietly abandoned. Lloyd's syndicates revised war risk underwriting standards. Coverage was tightened. Exclusions were expanded. Premiums were recalculated to reflect the reality that international law provided no protection against submarines. That civilian registry was a legal designation, not a shield. That ships carrying war materials into combat zones were targets, regardless of how many passengers were aboard. Cunard restructured its fleet around smaller, slower, more profitable vessels. Mauritania continued sailing, but without the flagship status Lusitania had enjoyed. The company shifted focus from prestige to efficiency, from records to reliability, from headlines to margins. The human cost, 1,198 deaths, was memorialized but never fully reckoned with. Monuments were erected, services held, names inscribed on plaques, but the families received £100 per life, processed through legal mechanisms designed to limit liability, not provide justice. And the question that had driven the entire venture, whether prestige could replace profit, whether capital could float indefinitely on reputation and subsidy, was answered definitively. It could not. The ship had been a monument to the belief that wealth, properly displayed, creates its own justification, that speed and luxury and British registry confer immunity from consequence. The torpedo revealed otherwise. It demonstrated that all assets, no matter how prestigious, are subject to the same physics, the same arithmetic, the same inevitability. Lusitania's final accounting showed a vessel that cost £2 million to build, generated perhaps £1 million in lifetime revenue, was insured for £600,000, and compensated victims at £100 per death. The math was brutal. The ship had been a luxury liner, transformed into a cautionary tale about the carrying costs of ambition. At sea, capital floats only until history decides otherwise, until a periscope appears, until a torpedo is fired, until the compartments flood faster than design anticipated, until 18 minutes erase 11 years of investment. The wreck remains on the seabed, collapsing slowly, corroding in salt water, visited occasionally by divers seeking artifacts or closure, or the thrill of touching a legend. The ship is gone. The passengers are gone. The subsidies are gone. The insurance policies have long since expired. What remains is the lesson, written in steel and debt and the cold arithmetic of disaster. Luxury vessels are not monuments. They are not permanent. They are burning balance sheets, floating through time, consuming resources, deferring costs, projecting invulnerability, while waiting for the moment when the ocean reminds them otherwise. Lusitania was England's most expensive shipwreck, not because of what she cost to build, but because of what she promised and failed to deliver, because of the gap between the myth sold and the reality that sank, because she embodied the delusion that prestige and capital, properly combined, could outrun consequence. The ledger closed in 1915. The ship disappeared in 18 minutes. But the reckoning, the slow, grinding process of determining who paid, how much, and at what cost to human dignity, continued for years. And in the end, as always, the ocean kept the hull. The insurers kept their reserves. The government kept its distance. The families kept their grief. And Cunard kept sailing. Because that is what companies do. They absorb losses. They restructure. They move forward. The ship becomes a line item. The disaster becomes a footnote. The monument becomes a cautionary tale, whispered in boardrooms when someone proposes building something too grand, too fast, too expensive to ever truly pay for itself. The dark story of Lusitania is not that she sank. Ships sink. The dark story is that she was allowed to sail, that tickets were sold, that warnings were ignored, that profit and prestige and political calculation overrode the simple truth that a vessel carrying civilians through a war zone was not a luxury liner. She was a gamble, and the ocean collected.